Good morning, everyone. In Christina's absence, it is my pleasure to preside over this morning's seminar, which will be delivered by Sari Nauman. And the talk is titled Time-Traveling Concepts, Historicizing Refugees and Internally Displaced Persons. Sari is a Pro Futura Scientia Fellow here, now in residence at Scas, and an Associate Professor of History at the University of Gothenburg. Sari is an early modern historian with a background in political science and philosophy. She completed her PhD in 2017 at the University of Gothenburg, where she was promoted to docent or associate professor in 2021. She has also held research positions at the Center for Privacy Studies at the University of Copenhagen, the University of Gothenburg, and Södertörn University. Sari's work is characterized by its innovative transdisciplinary approach, combining historical sources with social science theories, often from a transhistorical perspective. In her research, she explores concepts such as trust, security, and hospitality to understand how communities and individuals manage situations of intense uncertainty. And apart from being a Pro Futura Fellow, her work also benefits from her role as a PI of Humanitarian Great Power, the local reception of refugees in Sweden between 1700 and 1730, which is funded by the Swedish Research Council. Her publications include the award-winning monograph Ordenskraft, Politiska era i Sverige, between 1520 and 1718. I'll save you all from my trying to say that in Swedish. But the book, title is translated as The Force of Words, Political Oaths in Sweden. It was published by Nordic Academic Press in 2017. She also published co-edited volumes, namely Baltic Hospitality from the Middle Ages to the 20th century, Receiving Strangers in Northeastern Europe, with Palgrave in 2022, and Public, Private in the 18th Century Scandinavia, with Bloomsbury in 2021, as well as multiple articles and chapters in a wide range of journals and publications. Sari is, of course, also the recipient of several awards, including the Birger Karlsson Science Award in 2023 and the Clio Award in 2018. As a Pro Futura Fellow, Sari is engaged in researching early modern refugeedom into present-day understanding in her project Outsiders Within, Internally Displaced Persons in Early Modern Europe. Sari, thank you so much, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for the very nice introduction. I will be sitting down. I have some problems with my feet, so you have to look down at me. Thank you. Okay, so let's start. And I want to start with one of my sources as a true historian to present with you the initial problem that I've encountered. So here's Elisabeth Nilsdotter. Elizabeth was born in Estonia, on the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea and south of the Gulf of Finland, around 1635. In 1700, when she was 65 years old, the Great Northern War erupted as a Saxon army besieged the Livonian city of Riga. And for the next decade, Livonia, Estonia, and Ingria became the main theaters of war in repeated clashes between Russian, Saxon, Danish, and Swedish armies, causing great suffering among the populations. From 1710 onwards, the war spread to Finland, causing even more people to flee. Estimates give that during the 20 years that the war lasted, which is 1700 to 1720, around 20 to 30,000 people left their homes in Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and Finland and fled across the Baltic Sea to Sweden. Many of them would return after the war ended in 1720, but several would also stay within Sweden, having settled there and perhaps found work or married and having had children. Now, 70-year-old Elisabeth Nilsdotter and her daughter, Helena Jakobsdotter, were two peasants who managed to flee. They fled by hiding in the forest and lying in mountain caves in the cold winter, day and night, as Elizabeth recounted in her petition to the Swedish king. Others were not so fortunate, being taken away into forced labor in Russia or killed during battles or by passing armies. In their flight, we can first trace the two women to Haljala in Virland, on the northern coast of Estonia, where Elizabeth acquired a letter of conduct from Philip Kopff in September 1707. From there, they traveled on to Reval, present-day Tallinn, where another letter of conduct was issued on her behalf on July 7, 1708, this time by Nils Stromberg, the Governor-General of Estonia. Elizabeth and Helena must then have been able to travel to get on board a ship to Sweden, since Stromberg's letter was verified in Vaxholm, just outside of Stockholm, a month later. And they were still in Stockholm in April 1709, when a doctor examined Helena's eyes and diagnosed her with a black star, with no hope for improvement. Although she can still see some light of day, the doctor said, her eyesight will soon completely perish. And due to Helena's blindness and Elizabeth's age, 70 years old, they found themselves unable to work and thus in need of support or relief. A poor refugee, a persecuted stranger, Elizabeth called herself, as she repeatedly beseeched the king for help. Help so that I, who am a stranger fleeing the enemy and destitute, must not during this hard and difficult time perish and die. We do not know if they ever received any help, as the kept list of state beneficiaries do not mention their names, and in fact I have been unable to trace them in any other sources apart from these petitions. But let's stop here for a moment, because this is actually my main problem. What does this word, refugee, mean? What does it accomplish here? What did Elizabeth mean by using this term? What did it signal to her and to those hearing or reading it in 1708? And what does it signal to us, hearing or reading it 300 years later? Is it the same, and can we understand Elizabeth? I work with petitions such as Elizabeth's in trying to find out how early modern forced migrants positioned themselves during their flights. In petitions, ordinary subjects could approach the king and various other authorities with their pleas and problems, and petitions were in frequent use all across Europe at the time, and also beyond. Besides petition, I look at other sources, from city magistrates, from dioceses and state institutions, to learn how recipient communities identified and categorized migrants, and what impact this had on their reception. The question of categorization is just one part of what I do. I'm also interested, for example, in reception practices and in early humanitarianism and the like, but it is easily the part that occupies me most at the moment. And I'm happy to talk about these other aspects if you want. You're more than welcome to ask me about them later. But right now, I am hung up on the question of terms and concepts, how they translate into today's world, and how our own concepts and connotations, either of the words that early modern people used or of the theoretical concepts that we use to try to understand the past, how they influence our understanding of past situations. So this is the problem that I want to address today, and hopefully receive your help in approaching. I often think of historical research as an act of translation. We translate the past into our present terms, trying to make sense of it and to understand what happened and why. And as all acts of translation, substituting their words for ours is not a superior way of describing past experiences. It is simply a way for us to try to understand them. And something is always lost in translation. Certain differences might be hard to convey, and yet it is a means for us to understand that which is other and to help us become informed by that experience. And also, as all acts of translation, this historical translation is a two-way street. As we translate the past, we learn something about our own time and about our concepts and what they mean. We are forced to recognize connotations that we are not necessarily aware of. We are forced to address these connotations and consider alternate meanings to the words we use, alternate words, and even alternate potentialities. Jhumpa Lahiri, a writer and translator, has this to say about translation, which I think is equally true also for historical research. She says, "Translation will open up entire realms of possibilities. unforeseen pathways that will newly guide and inspire the writers, or then historians' work, and possibly even transform it. For to translate is to look into a mirror and see someone other than oneself. So the question that I'm raising is this: how do the words that we use to make sense of the experiences of Elizabeth and others like her affect our understanding of the past? In which ways do they distort the past? And in which ways do they challenge us in the present? The structure for today's talk is this. So first I'll talk about refugees and the concept today. What connotations does it evoke? Then I will move on to refugees as a concept in the past. What did past people mean when they talked about refugees? I'll then introduce the concept of IDPs and talk about what does it mean today, how is it defined, and how does it relate to the term of refugee. And then I will move on to trying to translate this concept into history. Could we possibly use it for history? If so, under which circumstances? Which will lead to the conclusions, a reconsideration of refugees and IDPs in history, and a discussion of what we could gain by broadening our conceptual toolbox, what risks there might be, and what potential gains we stand to gain. So let's start then by looking at the concept, at the word of refugee. Today, refugee has many competing definitions. According to Georgia Cole, refugee has become a concept rather than simply a term, meaning that it has a history of its own separate from that of its signifiers, the individuals that are encompassed by the term. And as a concept, it is distorted from its original meaning. It is filled with other, often emotional connotations for various political usages. The main definition that guides states today, but also research on refugees, is the UN definition from the Hague Convention of 1951, which reads as follows. A refugee is a person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of their nationality and is unable or unwilling, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country. Now, there are very many things to pick apart in this definition, and believe me when I say that scholars do. What is especially troublesome is that this definition has become not only used to identify people in need of help, but also abused to shut people out of that help, with states today competing in erecting structures to keep people out. And I'll not go into that discussion, but I just want you to take this with you before we return to Elizabeth, that the UN definition is definitely a child of its time that might have outgrown itself. Critically, and as has been put forth by Rebecca Hamlin and others, it upholds the migrant-refugee binary, that is, stating that refugees are not migrants and that the division between the two groups is sharp. According to the UN definition, refugees move because of persecution, whereas migrants move because they want to find a better job, a better place to raise a family, perhaps, or because of love or a multitude of other, often intersecting reasons. But as we know, people are complex and refugees are also complex and often decide to flee for many reasons. And the ones just mentioned can be part of it. So a sharp division between migrant and refugee is often untenable, and in fact can be quite harmful once we get into a discussion of whom to protect and whom to welcome. So most people agree that we should actually receive refugees, whereas sentiments towards receiving migrants is increasingly more hostile around the world. So keeping people out of the refugee category is an effective way for politicians to limit immigration without losing popular support. And I want to thank Aisha for pointing me towards Rieko Karatani, who has shown how the separation between the refugee regime and the migrant regime was not always a given, but a result of political decisions and power play after the Second World War. So this separation is not something inherent to the terms. It is a result of the UN's work. And I must say that I think it's a very dangerous separation indeed. But nevertheless, the question for us right now is, does Elizabeth fit this picture? Well, she is a person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of not race, perhaps, but religion might be part of it. Russians were Orthodox and repeatedly referred to as barbarous, referring to their beliefs. And religious clashes were, as we know, frequent in early modernity. Nationality, the third concept here, is a very problematic concept for early modernity, of course. As we know, nationalism comes much late in history, but membership of a particular social group, maybe that. And then comes this, outside of the country of their nationality. Well, Elizabeth certainly fled her home, right? But even if we disregard the second part here, nationality, which is foreign and unsuitable for the early modern period, was she outside of her country? What does that mean? Elizabeth fled her home because of war. The Russian armies threatened her life, they burned her village, they forced her to flee, and we traced her flight across the Baltic Sea to Sweden, where she pleaded for help and protection. This seems to place her within the category of refugee. But as many of you will know, the territory from which she fled, Estonia, was in fact Swedish during this time, and had been so since the late 16th century. The Baltic flight overall actually took place within the Swedish Empire, which before the Great Northern War encompassed Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and Finland. You see the territories here marked in yellow. All these territories from which people fled. So they fled within an empire rather than across countries. And that seems to place Elizabeth and the others outside of the UN definition of refugee, even if we disregard the presently marked claims about nationality. So Elizabeth was then not a refugee, as we understand the term. And if we read her through that lens of present time, we misunderstand or mistranslate her situation. And yet, early modern scholars tend to use this word refugee quite broadly. They use it to depict not only those who called themselves refugee, as Elizabeth, during this period, but also a wide array of other forced migrants, only rarely stopping to define what they actually mean by this term, refugee. The term has in early modern research come to stand for those who flee, regardless of reason, and without stopping to reflect what a state during this period actually is, and how we therefore can understand refugee reception practices and the experiences of flight. So if Elizabeth is not a refugee, as defined today by the UN, what did she mean then when she used the term? Well, although one could say that refugees have always existed, if one by that means that people have always fled conflicts and the like, the noun refugee is actually not that old. It first surfaced in the late 1500s, as Catholics fled the Dutch revolt. These people were the original refugees. That is, people had fled before, but they had not entered into a specific category of people for doing so. And during the late 17th century, the term became widespread across Europe, now denoting a certain group of Protestants, the Huguenots, pictured here you can see them here in the picture. The Huguenots fled confessionalization efforts in Catholic France, and it soon came to stand, refugee, for almost exclusively victimized Protestants, demonstrating a very clear religious overtone. These Protestant refugees were received by other Protestant communities as part of a holy duty to care for co-confessionalists. So religion was not only a main reason for flight, it was also a main aspect in refugee reception practices. And here's, I think, where it gets interesting to me, because the Huguenots were not just any refugees. Those Huguenots who made it abroad tended to belong to the upper strata of society. Research has demonstrated that they were mostly priests and burghers, wealthy tradesmen or craftsmen. They were well connected and with some means that allowed them to start over. Often they had an education that made it possible for them to find work and start new businesses. And more, they were also men. They were able-bodied men of a certain age, circa 20 to 40 years old. That is, old enough to work, but also young enough to have plenty of profitable years ahead of them. And they also had connections, especially in the printing business. Soon they started to publish narratives of their flights, stressing their religious zeal, their virtue, their righteousness. Their choice to flee had been in defense of the true faith, they claimed, and disseminating a narrative of heroic exile. And rulers around Europe soon became aware of the potential economic benefits in receiving these early modern refugees, and they started to compete over welcoming them. So in the Holy Roman Empire, for example, entire cities were founded to accommodate them, and privileges, tax exemptions, and special laws were issued on their behalf. And this separates the early modern refugee regime from the present-day refugee regime. The present-day refugee is often depicted in terms of state politics and ethnicity, fleeing because of internal or external warfare, and is received also due to state politics. They are not seen as sources of profit, although many actually have education and professional background and training, and although many are young, and incidentally also male, as the early modern refugees. But the early modern refugee fled because of religion and was received because of it. This is the connotations that the word had. So in research on how the refugee regime has changed over the centuries, this central difference is often brought up. A shift from religious refuge, where the refugee is a prominent person in society, to refuge due to state politics, where the refugee is someone in need of protection and help. Now let's turn to the question that I asked at the very beginning of the talk. What did Elizabeth mean when she used the word refugee? In turning to the Swedish king, Elizabeth used the Swedish term, of course, flykting. This word was new at the time to the Swedish language. In fact, Elizabeth's petition from 1708 is the very first recorded instance of the term in the Swedish language. Elizabeth and others who fled with her brought this noun into the Swedish language, most probably adopting it from the German term Flüchtling, since they came from the German-speaking previously Hanseatic provinces and cities around the Baltic coast. And as we've seen, the term had very specific connotations at the time. It signaled flight and precariousness, sure, but also it signaled religious purity, honorability, it signaled fervor. It put the receiving communities before an imperative choice to demonstrate their adherence to the true faith, Protestantism, by receiving and protecting those who had fled to uphold it. And more, it carried economic connotations as well. So receiving Huguenots had been a lucrative business for the Netherlands and for the Holy Roman Empire and Great Britain. It had been an opportunity that Sweden would actually lament having missed out on for centuries to come. So when Elizabeth used this term, she was making an argument of religious purity and zeal, placing herself within the context of those other persecuted masses, the Protestants fleeing other confessions, seeking to persecute them. In this case, she fled the Orthodox Russians, described in letters as tyrannical or barbarous and the like, and she asked the Swedish king to live up to his Christian duty of protecting fellow Protestants. If we focus then on the term that Elizabeth used, refugee, this puts her into context with these other significant migrations of the period, that of the Huguenots, and it allows us to trace the Huguenots' influence on what would later become ideas about humanitarianism and an international responsibility to care for refugees. It allows us to see why she used the terms she did, and it also helps us to see the actually biblically infused language that she and others used in their petitions, often quoting the Bible without making it explicit and with plenty of references to their own faith. So we can see then how the word refugee, how it traveled and was translated into other languages, other contexts. But perhaps also we can see how in those translations and iterations, how it slightly shifted its meanings. Because actually the Finnish and Baltic migrants did not exactly fit the previous usages of the term refugee either. First of all, Elizabeth and others who fled during the Great Northern War, they did experience persecution and great sufferings, but they did not exactly flee because of their religion. Although the Russians did adhere to the Orthodox faith, they had no intention in enforcing the inhabitants of the conquered territories to convert. In contrast, they had a history of allowing different faiths within their empires. And the Protestants who lived in Finland, Estonia, Livonia, and Ingria, etc., they would be allowed to keep practicing their Protestant faith and keep their churches alive. So, although Elizabeth was fleeing an enemy of a different faith than her own, who persecuted her, she was not necessarily persecuted because of that faith. Instead, she was fleeing for reasons of war or state politics, more akin to refugees today. And second, whereas other early modern refugees, as we've seen, often belonged to more affluent layers of society, such as burghers, craftsmen, priests, Elizabeth and her daughter did not. In fact, in contrast to the published refugee narratives of the period, the petitions from the Baltic and Finnish refugees, they talk about their utter destitution. They were poor, they were often sick, they were wounded in the war, physically or psychologically, or they were old, women and children. In fact, if we compare the Finnish and the Baltic migrants to other refugee collectives of the period, they stand out. In other collectives, the vast majority, as I said, were able-bodied men in the ages of 20 to 40 with a craftsmanship or education. Women were rare, some estimates suggest 10 to 20% women, and the elderly even rarer. But here are the numbers for the Finnish and Baltic migrants, as given by Johanna Aminoff-Winberg, a Finnish scholar who has done an excellent work in tracking these migrants across various archives. And as you can see here, females made up about 56% of these migrants. Peasants, at least 47%, probably even higher. Children, 42%, so almost half of these migrants were children underaged. And women and children put together make up the total of 72% of these refugees. And in addition to these numbers, a considerable part of these migrants were defined as elderly, with some ages given as high as 95 years old, which is a very considerable age during this time. And from my work with the petitions, I have also found even more elderly people, children, and a large number of sick or disabled persons, either from birth or wounded in the war. So the migrants from Finland, they differed very significantly from those for whom European rulers would found new cities and offer privileges to attract. These migrants would not easily find any work. They would not attract new opportunities to Sweden. They carried no promise of profit. So as you see, while Elizabeth does not fit into our concept of the refugee, neither does she fit into the early modern concept of a refugee. Both concepts misrepresent her situation. So how are we then to translate her experiences into today if we have no words for representing them? Well, one approach is to investigate why she was allowed entry into Sweden. On what grounds was she and the others from Finland and the Baltic countries received? Well, the title of today's talk, of course, gives you a hint. Let's move from the concept of refugee to the concept of IDP and see how that works for us. Sorry about the bad text format. Okay, apart from the refugee-migrant binary, there is another binary built into the UN's definition of refugee, namely the refugee IDP binary. Refugees are those who are outside of their country. IDPs, internally displaced persons, in contrast, are those that stay within their country, not crossing any national borders. The UN definition of IDPs runs as follows. Internally displaced persons are persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, and who have not crossed an international or recognized state border. This definition was put forth in 1998 and served to enable a discussion of those people that had been left outside of the international refugee regime and its instruments for protection. By naming those who fled within countries, the concept was meant to facilitate help efforts and expedite research on this vulnerable group. So, what happens then if we let the concept of IDP travel back in time to early modernity? And this is what I'm trying out, and I think that it captures something that the term refugee does not, so let's test it with Elizabeth. Could we characterize Elizabeth as an IDP, as she was fleeing within the Swedish Empire? In some ways, yes. When I present her case to people, many seem more inclined to define her as an IDP than a refugee, simply because she moved within an empire. This would be a simple translation of IDP to early modernity. We simply substitute state with empire and claim that those who are forcibly displaced within empires are IDPs. But see, here we also run into problems, because an empire is not really translatable into a state, not to mention a national state, as is the case here. Elizabeth was a person who had been forced to leave her home, and in a way she did not cross a recognized state border, but in another way she actually did. Because an empire worked very differently than a state does, the translation is flawed, and this is why. The fact that Estonia had been Swedish for 100 years at the time does not mean that there was no border between them. They were decidedly different territories, and although they were subjected to the same king, Estonia, for example, followed different laws than Sweden did. So in Sweden, all four estates, which is peasants, burghers, priests, and nobles, had representation in the parliament and thus a say in political matters. Estonia, on the other hand, was to a large extent a self-ruling territory, with major political decisions made by the General Assembly, consisting of old German-speaking aristocracy. And this aristocracy had widespread powers and, for example, resisted any attempts by the Swedish to abolish serfdom. So Estonian peasants could be serfs, whereas Swedish peasants couldn't. So the peasants in Sweden and Estonia lived very different lives. And furthermore, the peasants in Estonia, they would speak Estonian, but also Livonian and Latvian seems to have been frequent. Swedish was not a major language in the countryside and often not understood. Swedish was only spoken in the port cities along the Baltic coast, where Swedish burgher families had settled through intermarriages with Estonian burghers, and where Swedish civil servants had been placed to manage tax and church matters. But German was actually far more frequently spoken in these towns. But then again, German would be spoken in Stockholm at this time as well. The same goes for Finland. While the coastal towns had a Swedish and/or German-speaking population, peasants from the countryside sometimes only spoke Finnish. And these migrants would, of course, have a very hard time to make themselves understood in Sweden or to find work or a new home. So you see that even though Estonia was a territory that belonged to the Swedish Empire, the degree to which Estonia was Swedish depends on how you look at it. The full title of the King of Sweden was introduced to upheld these differences between his various territories. This is his title, Charles XII, King of Sweden. He was Grand Prince of King of Sweden, the Goths and the Wends, Grand Prince of Finland, Duke of Scania, Estonia, Livonia, Karelia, etc. I will not read the full title. But these different titles signaled that these territories stood in different relations to him. They were not on par, they were not the same state. That's why we call it an empire, not a state. And the difficulties in equaling a state with an empire is evident also when we start to look at the colonial empires of the period, of course, such as Great Britain or Spain, within which we also have forced migrations during this period. And the same goes for Elizabeth and Helena and the thousands of others who fled with her. We might call them Swedes, since the territories did belong to the Swedish king, but we could also easily and just as correctly designate them as Estonians, burghers or peasants, Protestants, and perhaps these terms would actually be terms that they themselves would feel more comfortable using. In fact, very, very few people during this era used national terms to define themselves. Nationality was not a prime identity. Geographically, people tended instead to identify with much smaller units, such as their hometowns or their region. But overall, several investigations have shown that religion and class were far more important as identifiers. So we seem to run into a problem here. Elizabeth and the thousands who fled with her, they do not fit into our present categories of either refugee or IDP. She was neither, in a way. So what was she then, and how are we to make sense of her and her experiences? Well, there is no way of approaching IDPs from the side of history, of course. The concept did not exist during this period. There were other concepts, for example, stranger or exile or even foreigners. And these concepts were used quite frequently, not as frequently as the word refugee, but still, to depict the people from Finland and the Baltic countries, and also to depict other forced migrants, and also to depict non-forced migrants. But I want to give you a different approach, one that tries to reconceptualize IDPs for the early modern period by going back to the binary of refugee and IDP, and the grounds that the UN used to separate these two concepts. The UN's definition of refugee and IDP are dependent upon each other. They are mutually exclusive and they are meant to be binary. The focus on states' borders makes this plain. But in fact, little else separates them. In Anna Krasteva's words, one and the same type of migrant fleeing for the same reasons are classified differently in regards to their incapacity for crossing the borders. Refugees are those who succeed, and internally displaced persons are those who don't. But borders are not as fixed and firm as they are sometimes presented to be. As a result, it is not always easy to categorize people as the one or the other, even for the present world. Almost 2 decades ago, Ilana Feldman demonstrated how the categories of refugee and dispossessed citizens, we can translate that into IDP, frustrated humanitarian aid projects in Gaza, since the distinction was unable to address the needs on the ground and was sometimes also arbitrary in this classification. And problems like this are still there. Other groups encounter adjacent difficulties, in particular those who are not recognized but as citizens or identify with a population living across several state borders, or those who are citizens in a country who have disintegrated, leaving them in the same place but with uncertain citizenship. They are displaced in place. So this focus on borders has been criticized by scholars and practitioners alike on the grounds that it formulates a geographical problem when the question should be about needs and how we can, as an international community, ensure that those needs are accommodated. So why does the UN then focus on national borders, despite the problems that arise from it? Well, basically, and I'm simplifying a very complex debate here, I know, it is about assigning responsibility. So as long as people remain within their own country, the responsibility to protect them resides with the sovereign nation. And the UN generally lacks the mandate to interfere except for in exceptional cases. But when people cross national borders, the UN can assume responsibility without risking to negate national sovereignty. So it is sovereignty which, in the UN definitions, has been translated into a territorial question. It has become territorialized. But sovereignty is not, or at least is not necessarily, a territorial concept. And here's where history can help, I think. Sovereignty was heavily discussed in early modernity. And you all know about the sovereign kings, such as the Sun King, Louis XIV, here pictured. They were said to have derived their power directly from God, put on this earth to rule. But sovereignty for early modern people was not primarily about territorial control or borders. Historians have for quite a long time criticized this claim put forth by scholars of international relations that the Peace of Westphalia of 1648 changed the world, since European powers now started to recognize that territorial borders should be respected. This was not the case. Such a world order was very foreign in this period. It would take centuries to materialize. Instead, sovereignty was about control over people, over subjects. Even for the most far-reaching scholars, those who were most in favor of an extensive meaning to the concept of sovereignty and absolutism, I'm thinking here, for example, of Thomas Hobbes, sovereignty was a reciprocal concept. It depicted a political relationship between ruler and subject and entailed certain responsibilities on both parts. Subjects owed allegiance and loyalty to their sovereign king, often to be demonstrated through the payment of taxes. And in return, the king owned his, or in rare instances her, subjects' protection. The responsibility to protect was a fundamental aspect of the political contract, and not merely an abstract ideal. These mutual obligations, they materialized in the ruler's coronation oaths and the subject's oath of loyalty, which were common practices throughout early modern Europe, and a frequent argument also made in rebellions, political upheavals, and wars. And there's definitely a religious aspect here, which I'll not go into. I don't have time simply, but feel free to ask me about that later on. So this obligation to protect was quite far-reaching. For example, it encompassed subjects in newly acquired territories, overseas colonies, even in foreign territories, because it was tied to the subject and not to the territory. And this is my suggestion then. I want to use IDPs as a concept for early modernity. If I want to do that, it is not enough to simply translate the territorial claims made in that concept to the territorial understanding of early modern empires. We need to revisit the very reason for conceptualizing IDPs and translate that instead into historical terms. So consequently, understanding IDPs in this historical context should not be confined to a territorial perspective, focusing solely on those fleeing within a specific territory, but rather viewed as a relational concept, pertaining to those who stood in subject relations to specific rulers. This approach better reflects the complex nature of early modern states and empires, which comprised composite kingdoms, overseas empires, colonies spanning the globe, and personal unions of crowns, and where territories had very different relations to one and the same ruler. What would be the consequences of reformulating IDPs in terms of subjecthood rather than territoriality? The test for this reformulated concept would be, does it help us to see something else? Does it help us to better understand the situation that we're studying? First, let's look at Elizabeth and the other Baltic and Finnish migrants in the early 18th century, before taking a step back and look at other migrations across the world at the time. Well, when it comes to the Baltic and the Finnish migrants, their position as subjects to the Swedish king definitely had an impact on them being received in Sweden. In fact, when hearing the Russian armies were closing in on Finland, the Swedish king ordered his councilmen to urge his subjects there to flee. Urge them, who are still in Viborg or in other places in Finland where the enemy is, that they take their leave from there under our protection. And make sure to be prepared to provide them, who thus come to you, with their sustenance, through suitable means and manners, as long as they are away from their homes. Now, one can actually read this command in different ways. Either the king took his obligation to protect very seriously and acted as best he could to ensure that his subjects were safe, or perhaps a more realist interpretation is that his decision to urge them to flee was grounded in a fear that if they stayed, they would soon be supplying the Russian army with food and soldiers. So by fleeing, he ensured himself that the Russian army would only be met by deserted farms, and while hoping all the same that the fleeing peasants could help and take over farms that had previously been deserted in Sweden. There is some evidence also to support this latter interpretation. But not only did the king urge them to flee, as the Finnish and Baltic migrants arrived to Sweden, they soon realized that not much came of the promised protection. There were no funds to support them, there were no work for them to take over, and they were actually in no shape to work either. Nevertheless, the king forbid them from returning to their previous homes. As long as the war continued, they were forbidden to leave Sweden. He was afraid that once more they would contribute to the Russian war effort. Once the war ended in 1720, however, they were ordered to return home as soon as possible. So the flight of these migrants was very much on the king's terms, and that to me indicates that their status as subjects heavily influenced both their flight and their reception. But that's not all. In their petitions, they themselves frequently referred or made use of their interiority and their subjecthood. Their pleas for help were, almost without exception, accompanied by references to their previous services to the king, be it as soldiers, mothers of soldiers, civil servants, priests, or taxpayers. In this ways, their petitions were very similar to other petitions by subjects to the king, who asked for help or forgiveness and argued for their case by referencing the reciprocal political relationship. They had offered long-standing loyalty, and now it was time for the king to offer protection. The claim for protection even went so far that when the Baltic and Finnish migrants realized that there were no funds to support them, a few of them actually became angry and resentful. In some cases, they attacked the commissions that were appointed to help them. And if this is not an indication that these migrants felt that they had a right to protection and help, I don't know what is. On the other hand, there is also evidence that the Swedish communities receiving them were not necessarily as convinced of the obligation to protect them as these refugees were, or these migrants were. At least they were not convinced that they were the ones who were supposed to provide this protection. We have plenty of sources referring to these Finnish and Baltic migrants as strangers or foreigners, arguing that the communities needed to care for their own first. So, for the Finnish and Baltic migrants, the concept of IDPs, translated into an early modern setting, it helps us explain not only why they fled and were received in Sweden, but also why the situation became so stressed. Whereas in some ways they did belong, it was also argued that they did not belong. So there was a struggle over how to define these people, whether they were IDPs or refugees. Could the concept then also contribute to other settings? Well, I've been working with some scholars who analyzed the forced migrations in the wake of revolutionary wars in the late 18th century in the Americas, but also across the Atlantic. And let's take one of these groups as the other example, the Loyalists, those who stood on the side of the British Empire as British North America rebelled and fought back on colonial control. On the side of Britain was not only servants of the state, people employed in the military, but also several slave communities, peasants, and others who thought that a distant British Empire was a far better ruler than a closer one, or hoped to freedom in exchange for helping out, which was also the case. With the founding of the United States of America, those loyalists were forced to flee, and some of them spread out across the Caribbean or South Americas, others went to Europe, to Britain, and even beyond. Carolyn Shaw and others have studied the flight of these individuals, who called themselves refugees, and are also depicted as refugees by scholars. Shaw has shown how they were received by the British Empire, who made a name for itself as a bastion of liberty by caring for these and other refugees, something that was only made possible by the fact that Britain had colonies across the world in which to distribute the refugees. But what happens if we, perhaps not instead, but also look at these revolutionary refugees as IDPs within the British Empire? They fled a colony that liberated itself from the empire, but throughout their flight they stayed within the empire, and they argued for their reception by referencing their services to the crown. Their loyalty, they referenced their subjects' duty, and as is shown by Shaw's investigation, they were received by reference to this loyalty and the empire's obligation to protect them. So as you see here, the history of refugees and IDPs is entangled. The early modern idea that refugees should be received and cared for built, at least in quite a few cases, on an idea of interiority, that the refugees received in some ways already belonged, either due to a shared religion or due to shared subjecthood. And because of this interiority, some of the people who were then categorized as refugees, a category that has stuck with them throughout the centuries, they can also arguably be categorized as IDPs. But why would this matter? Why should we, what we decide to call them in the end? Why is it important? Well, I believe that if historians start to look for IDPs in history rather than only look for refugees, we will find a lot more people on the move, or being forcibly moved, encountering similar problems, although sometimes they are hidden in the sources. They are, for example, peasants who fled, indigenous populations forcibly displaced, enslaved persons escaping slave owners, or climate migrants trying to escape famines and drought or pestilence and the like. Note that I'm not saying that all of these groups necessarily are IDPs. I'm merely suggesting that it would be interesting to see what the term IDP can accomplish in these settings. What can it help us see? If we have a term for these people, we can start investigating their intersected stories and see how they related to each other and how the reception of these groups related to each other if they did. In short, a term will provide visibility, much as it has done in the present world. This term also has the potentiality to diversify our understanding of the early modern refugee regime. If we look in handbooks on refugee studies, early modern refugees are often grouped together under the umbrella term of religious refugees, as I mentioned before, contrasting them with present-day refugee movements, which are identified based on national or ethnic belonging, or territorial belonging for that matter. But by introducing the concept of IDPs to history, we can expand this categorization and delve deeper into diverse experiences and identities of early modern displaced populations, beyond just a religious affiliation. And finally, there is the benefits of talking the same language as we do when we meet, using English, or perhaps sometimes Swedish, and I'm looking at you, Carolina. By translating the early modern experience into a term that is frequently used today, that we can use, my hope is to enable a transdisciplinary and transhistorical dialogue. But to achieve that, I think that we need to make the translation process more visible and transparent and point out to what is lost in translation. That was all from me for now, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you.